I came across this completely by accident, but the more I looked into it, the more I was like, wow, these cows just keep dying out there. And I have a few other opinions on it as well, but I don't know. I'm curious to know what you guys think, because, coincidence, like, we're having an egg shortage and we see an egg farm in the US catch on fire, destroying about 100,000 layers. And then just the other day, we see an egg farm in New Zealand catch on fire and destroys about 75,000 egg layers. And that happened right after New Zealand had come out with a report saying they needed about 300,000 more hens to offset the egg shortage in New Zealand. We're not the only ones facing an egg shortage. And the next day you have this massive fire that takes out 75,000. So now they need 375,000 hens to make up for the egg shortage. This has more to do with cattle, but real quick, I've been doing some of these videos out here on the back of my truck, and some of you are probably wondering why the change of scene and where's the big old cowboy hat. Well, we actually do have our own farm, our own ranch. I just don't do a lot of videos on it anymore because what I want to share with people is agriculture. I want them to see the diversity of farms that are out there, get people to start thinking about where their food comes from, because we live in a Jetson society where everybody lives in a city and they forget. And when they forget, you end up having all these wacky policies that end up just shutting farmers out of business. And farmers make up most of the conservation land. Privately owned land is actually better managed in many cases than national properties. And I recently watched a video of conservation of bears and talking about the importance of ranchers put out by the Wildlife Conservation Society. And it was a fascinating video, but it was very true. Ranches and private land ownership are important. So when we see policies come out that are backfiring on these people, like the water policy that the Biden administration came out on, and all these things are just they cause a lot of damage to the industry. Now, I understand that high intensity farming does have some environmental impacts, and unfortunately, I don't know how you solve that issue, but in any case, most of my videos have nothing to do with our farm. Plus, I think it's a little weird to just sit around and share my farming stories with you guys on my farm all the time. I'm not the expert on it, and I think that, to be honest with you, there's so many different animals and land that nobody is really an expert on anybody else's farm. So the best way to learn about farming and ranching is to get yourself into the community, get yourself into the society, see the variety that's out there. We've been on our channel, we've shared farms from Maine all the way out to Wyoming, Texas, Oklahoma, and places in between, Missouri, Ohio, and that's what's going to teach you the most. Is just to learn from all those different people, very smart people, and just a great community in general. But I wanted to show you this too before I get started. This is pretty cool. This came from the Buffalo Wool Company. It is a bison leather and wool. So they actually trim this wool to make it really soft and smooth. But it's a nice little gun case that Ron gave me last time I was visiting him in Texas. And they actually make these and sell them. I'm not sure if they're on their website. You might have to contact the Buffalo Wool Company about it. But he also makes them for long guns. Ron, I'd love to have one for my long gun. So cattle and dying, they just keep dying, right? I search news articles periodically, pull up news and sometimes I see what Google recommends. This actually came from a Google recommendation. But I noticed a pattern lately of cattle haulers crashing. And after like 4 of these coming across my news feed in different states, I thought I would do a search on, cattle and their, trailer crashes or cattle involved with crashes. And because of the way that this stuff is reported, you'd have to do like multiple different searches. But I came up with enough to create a pattern here, because there are an astronomical amount of cattle hauler crashes just between now and August. At least I think it's an astronomical amount. I think it's a lot. And I'm not saying that there's anything to this. I mean, I don't see how you can cause these things to happen. Of course, I'm sure if you consulted with the Clintons, you might be able to figure it out, or the royal family, you could probably figure out how to make this work. But from my perspective, I don't know how anybody would make this work. But check this out. This is what I came up with on this, because it's a lot. Like when you see this come across your news feed on a daily basis, I mean, I recognize that I'm interested in cattle, so Google's just giving me the stuff I'm interested in. But I feel like it's too much of a coincidence, because we're facing cattle shortages. You have thousands of cattle die in a heat wave, and I still can't completely explain that one. I see some of the concerns that vets brought up on that. And I was thinking maybe it could be something with the aquifers being low, maybe there being too much aflatoxins in the water. I don't know. It was a bit unusual, because it was also, somewhat consolidated to an area, but not a specific, ranch or feedlot, and it just seemed a little bit unusual to me. It's kind of like people, at young ages these days, dying suddenly. Is it stress, or is it something else? You just don't know. There's just a lot to think about. So where is this? I've got a lot of things pulled up on my phone, because there's a lot of things we need to talk about. Try and cover some of these subjects over the next couple of days, because sometimes I read about them, fascinating topics, and then I never do a video on them. But all right, so let's go back here to, well, it's not going to load very well, August 12th of 2022. I don't get great reception out here. A cattle hauler flips over an I-44, shuts down traffic, okay? So then you go to August 18th, just a few days later. 2 people, 1 horse injured following Elgin County crash. Now, there was a cattle hauler also involved in that crash. Let's see. Crash involving 5 vehicles and a cattle hauler. 2 dead in Milam County. And that one was September 6th. So now we're on to September. Semi-trailer with cattle crash on Highway 151. This one was... Well, I'm just going to post it up here, because my phone's not loading all of these. Nearly 50 cattle die after a cattle truck rolled over. That came from 1011 Now News. And I want to say, once again, we're going to have a hard time loading out here. So you'll see where that one is. And I'll put the state and name down there, too, so we get it all. But there was one I just deleted about a cattle hauler with cattle that escaped on the highway. We've got another livestock trailer hauling hogs overturns an Iowa highway. I believe, did this one... I may have put in livestock trailer on that one. That one may not have anything to do with cows. Cows on the loose at Cherokee Park. That was after another highway crash there. I-94 crash kills Bismarck man and 4 cows. Trying to see that's October 22nd, so we haven't even, we're still in like that September-October range here. Several cows die on Highway 6 cattle trailer rollover. That was November 1st. And we come over here, we've got crews working to wrangle cattle after tractor trailer overturns in Coke County. That's off of I-40 West. Semi-trailer crash kills 9 dairy cattle in Dodge County. There's a Norfolk emergency to tipped over livestock trailer as well in Nebraska. So these aren't all related. Okay, so cows on the loose. Cattle trailer crashes on Loop 101 in Glendale. That would be Arizona, I believe. 13 cows killed, 14 still loose after trailer turns over on I-64 in Warwick County. We're picking up some steam here, if you notice. Tractor trailer hauling livestock crashes on I-20. U of I veterans respond to cattle trailer crash. This was in December. Semi-hauling cattle overturns on Highway 52. It's not to be confused with the accident that happened on Highway 50. Cattle rounded up by cowboys after truck overturns in Garden City. That would have been fun to watch. Not the crash. The cowboys rounding up the cattle on the highway. I mean, these things are tragic. People get hurt. People get injured. Cattle die. Cattle hauler overturns with 80 head in northeast Jasper County, Missouri. 2 injured and in Larned semi Wednesday rollover crash. Loaded cattle trailer prompts multi-county assistance. 14 head of cattle killed in truck rollover in Jamestown. Let's see, in Midlothian, Texas, there was a cattle crash. Can I get the headline here? Is it going to load? It's not going to load. Okay. Cattle trailer cut in half when semi fails to yield in southwest Kansas, patrol says. That's pretty tough. How do you cut those trailers in half? Somebody must have been hauling into that one. There's another one here. Cattle trailer overturns. It's a Wisconsin article. News 8000. And we've got local news. Semi-truck crash in... Oh, I hate that these aren't loading. Right here, you can see it. Let's see. Cattle trailer crashes closing I-90 between Logan and Manhattan. That was actually a pretty big accident. So, you know, I'm not saying that there's anything to this. I'm just saying that driving cattle trailers is getting really dangerous out there. I mean, the accidents are picking up, and it's killing a lot of cows. I mean, every single one of these trailers that flips over, there was a cattle trailer that flipped over. This is what started it. It was 70 head of cattle a couple weeks ago, and only like 2 or 3 escaped. I mean, it was a pretty big deal. But these are accidents that just seem to be happening at a time when we're facing a cattle shortage, beef shortage. And it could be, too, just the increase of cattle on the move because everybody's trying to get rid of their cows and send them to slaughter because of the drought conditions that they've been facing. Like I said, we're not going to see a rebound in that capacity for some time. But, you know, it's interesting. Cattle ranching in general has become extremely dangerous recently. It's probably going to end up on one of those most dangerous jobs lists. If you look down in Arizona and Texas, you hear reports. There was a rancher in Arizona who has come across, you know, on average in like the last 8 months or something, he's come across about 100 migrants on his land, just camping out on his land. Now, these migrants could be peaceful people. I'm sure a majority of them are peaceful people, but some of them can be extremely dangerous. We have arrested thousands who are criminals, convicted criminals, and you know, involved with drug trafficking. I mean, you should see the amount of drugs that are coming over the border, and you've got terrorists coming over. And so, you know, these ranchers down in Arizona and Texas, it's not like you just let their kids go out, learn to ride, you know, help bring in the cattle, because they don't know what to expect anymore. They go out, they find all these people. The guy who came across over 100, I think he was saying that he came across 16 dead people on his property. I mean, that's a lot for these ranchers to take in. And the concern there is more than just the people themselves, because you could have a perfectly harmless migrant come over the line. They're making a bad choice by breaking the law of the country that they're about to go into. So I wouldn't say they're perfectly harmless. I mean, you have to remember that they're starting out on the wrong foot here, but they are coming over. They could be very friendly. They could be very nice. But the one of the issues that I've read about lately is that the countries that these people are traveling through, they could be walking through these fields and then walk into our fields, and they could be carrying all sorts of things on their boots, like foot and mouth disease, and they could also be carrying over materials. They could be carrying African swine fever. I mean, these are both diseases that have impacted some of these countries that these people are coming out of, and they could be transferring that right over our border. And so it doesn't even have to be necessarily a dangerous person. It doesn't have to be a drug trafficker. It doesn't have to be a terrorist. Somebody could come over and involuntarily well, let me change that because they're voluntarily breaking the law. But somebody could, by mistake, be a bioterrorist by carrying one of these diseases over. And let me tell you something. If foot and mouth disease is discovered in the US, what happens impacts every single one of you, because what they'll do is they will shut down for a minimum all cattle movement across the U.S. for 72 hours so that they can trace and track where that cow came from. And if it takes longer than 72 hours, then the cattle industry stays shut down for even longer. And as we know from during the pandemic, that even a meat processing facility shutting down operations for a short period of time could have a ripple effect in our supply chain for weeks, sometimes even months, depending on how long that shutdown was and how severe it was. It would be pretty severe to stop the complete flow of beef across the United States, even for 72 hours. So what could happen coming over that border, it could inflict some serious danger on our entire industry. And then African swine fever, if that entered in this country, it would just wreak havoc on pork. Hoof and mouth disease could infect both pork and cattle. Now, and somebody may do it on purpose too, because there's nobody really stopping these people. I mean, they're just coming right over the border on a daily basis, and it's a bit concerning. I mean, it is a bit concerning when you think about the security risks, whether intentional or unintentional. Arguably, they're all somewhat intentional, because if you're not going through the safety protocols to come into the country, if you're kind of bypassing that stuff, you're putting people at risk. And maybe that education hasn't been put out there, so it could be, maybe they just don't understand the potential risks that they're creating for the country that they're trying to go into. But it could very well, the smallest little incident could destroy our country. And the problem is that they're camping out in fields, grocery fields, where you're getting produce. They're camping out in people's ranches, and so you don't know, what was left behind that those animals are then going to go graze over, or what could be ending up going into the crops that we're consuming, because there are biological threats unintentionally that are intentionally coming over with somebody breaking a rule, that could impact so much in our food security. I mean, it's kind of, when you think about it, when you really, really think about it, it's a pretty scary thing. And then when you really start to think about it, you wonder how it hasn't already happened, because of the amount that we're getting. The other thing that I've talked about when it comes to agriculture and the situation along the border, I know I'm not allowed to call it a crisis, but it is kind of a crisis. This is a humanitarian crisis. People are dying trying to make this trek. I mean, the problem isn't necessarily the border itself. The problem is somewhere else. And we actually had we started to kind of cut down on the problem a little bit by telling these countries that we're supplying aid to, we're going to cut off the aid if you don't do certain things to make the lives better for the people there, so they stop coming to us. And the other problem, I think, and this is probably my own little tangent here, but if you look at the spending of the U.S., so under Biden, we have gone from about $400 million a year in interest payments to over $800 million a year. We've doubled our interest payments in the U.S. And so when you look at these budgets that come across that are astronomical budgets, and you look at the numbers, the first $3 trillion, almost $4 trillion in the budget each year covers interest and welfare. And a lot of this welfare is going to people who aren't even citizens, because it's the humane thing to take care of these people. But the problem is because we have those humanitarian policies, we're actually creating a humanitarian crisis where people are dying to try and be a part of it. And then on top of that, we've got generations that are going to be paying over. We're going to be up to close to just a trillion alone in interest payments each year. So when you see these $5-6 trillion budgets coming across, you have to realize that a fifth of that is just interest, just paying our debt interest for the country. I don't see how we can keep it up. I think that we're going to have a government financial crisis right around the corner. And I'm not talking about raising the debt ceiling. I'm just talking about the simple fact that it's not feasible to believe we can keep paying $1 trillion a year in interest. I mean, we're not at $1 trillion. We're at 800 something million, but still, we've doubled that in just a couple of years. If this keeps up, I mean, we'd be at 1.6 trillion in a couple of years. I mean, it's a scary thing to think about. And I kind of got off track there for a little bit. But my point is that with agriculture, you know, the border situation has created other areas of issues. I interviewed an onion farmer about a year ago, and you can watch, I'm going to be putting those full interviews up with Dr. Moore, with Alex Newman, with the onion farmer, with all the different people I've interviewed. Gosh, I can't forget his name. But we've done several interviews, and I'll do some more interviews. All of those will be available to those who join our membership level of the Thinkers Club. And you'll be able to watch the uncut versions, even the side conversations that we have, which could get a little dicey at times, as you can imagine. But the reality is that because of the situation along the border, the visa program has slowed down considerably. And what happened in the case of the onion farmer is he had asparagus fields that he was trying to harvest. And the workers were held up at the border for over a month. Well, you know, plants don't wait to be harvested, right? And so what ended up happening is he couldn't find local workers to harvest his crop. He couldn't get his visa workers over to harvest the crop. So he went on TikTok and just said, whoever wants to come out and harvest this can have it, whatever they want, because that's a lost crop. And thousands of people showed up to harvest asparagus. So they'll work for food, but they won't work for money. But it was an interesting situation, but it's a situation that we face on a daily basis. So a lot of people think that these farmers and ranchers are against migrants coming across the border. They're just against it illegally, because the reality is they need them for their business, but they're also feeling the impacts of the chaos that's going on at the border and not being able to get legal workers across the border to work. And if you don't have people in the U.S. willing to do the job, you have to have those seasonal workers come across the border. That said, you know, in the U.S., and maybe this is worth a whole nother video, we saw the jobless claim, the jobs report in January. It just wow everybody, right? You had 517,000 jobs gained. But if you dig into it, if you really look at it, right before the jobs report came out, the establishment survey came out with a list of changes to how they calculate the jobs number, so a list of adjustments. And so what they do is they went through and they made all these adjustments to how they were going to calculate the jobs number this year in January. Clever idea. Because the unadjusted was actually a loss of 2.5 million jobs. So their adjustments created 3 million jobs, and all of a sudden you have this blowout jobs number. The other thing that I thought was interesting on it was the amount of part-time workers. You've had this crash in full-time employment and this increase in part-time jobs. And you know, you have to remember that there are people working multiple part-time jobs. There's some people working up to 3 part-time jobs. So these jobs aren't necessarily going to lots of different people. And they're not like it's a big number of jobs. In fact, it was negative 2.5 million. But we're going to say, okay, if you did get 500,000 jobs, what you have to realize is that most of those are part-time jobs where people are working more than one job. There are people with a full-time job that are having to work a part-time job to make up for the inflation. And when we talk about cutting back on inflation, we're not talking about lowering the pricing. That would be called deflation. We're not talking about deflation. When the government is talking about slowing inflation, they're talking about slowing the rate of inflation. So their target is 3 or 4%. To them, that would sound good, especially after the last couple of years. 3 or 4% would sound good. But in the past, the target inflation rate has been closer to 2%. So life is never going to go back to the way it used to be. And if you look at probably one of the biggest, and well, this is where I'm saying I could almost go on to a whole other video here. But when you look at one of the biggest indicators of our economy, you see this massive drop in disposable income in Americans. I mean, it is the worst that we have seen since the Great Depression. That's our economy right now. And like I said, the sad thing is we still can't convince people to go out and harvest crops and work on a farm. So we rely on immigrant workers. it's baffling. It baffles me, but I also recognize that, that $3 or $4 trillion that I was talking about each year that we just pay out of pocket for welfare programs. A lot of that is, unemployment, SNAP, and the benefits to a certain extent end up outweighing the benefit of going to work. And I can tell you, as an employer, I used to run a commercial property company. And some of my maintenance guys, the guys that were earning, this was back in 2008 to 2015 that I had a lot of maintenance employees. And they were earning, on the low end, $15 an hour and up to about $20 an hour. So I don't know what that, back then I felt like it was pretty good, especially since 2008 was a recession. But they would come to me and tell me that they couldn't work after a certain amount of time, because if they did, they would lose their benefits. And if they lost their benefits, even if they worked more, then they wouldn't make up for their benefits. So they would basically tell me, if you want me to keep working for you, you got to give me a few days off so I can cut back on my hours. And I dealt with that on a regular basis. Guys, basically, and as an employer, you're stuck because you need the employee there. It's harder to replace them, but they're basically saying, if you can't do this for me, I'm going to have to quit and go somewhere else. And you're already paying them the maximum you can to be profitable. So it was just like, how does this make any sense? How does it work? And now I'm sure it's even worse, because you look at those numbers, the numbers that we're paying out into those programs now, and they're astronomical compared to how they were back then. So I could only imagine. I don't employ anybody now. I work for myself. I keep to myself. We bring in contractors to help us with videography and stuff when we're out filming. But and I've considered hiring somebody to help out with our farm. But it is just such a mess. It is such a mess. But anyway, what do you think about those coincidences of the cattle trailer? That's what I was starting off with, was cattle haulers. What do you think of those? You think it's coincidence? Do you think the Clintons are out training the government on how to do it? I mean, how does this? I don't know. But it just seems like, even when I was going through that list from August, you started to see an increase in September. You started to see an increase in October. You started to see an increase in November and December. And I blamed it for a second there on cattle movement, but in reality, less cattle were going to slaughter at the end of the year than in that August-September timeframe. So in reality, there should have been more accidents then, and there was more traffic on the road. So that is a very curious thing. Why are we saying, is there a problem with the trailer brakes? Is there something else going on? Maybe it's bad jujus. I mean, I don't know. But all I can say is, if you're a cattle rancher these days, life is dangerous for you. You're either dealing with people coming across the border and camping out on your land that you're going to encounter on a daily basis, or you're getting run off the road in your cattle trailer. I mean, it's a difficult time. I don't know the answers for it. And like I said, I don't want to start something saying this is a conspiracy. I just think it's an odd statistic, and these odd happenings like the eggplant fires happening at the right time of the shortages, they make me kind of second guess my own objectivity to it.